Good evening, welcome. We are now turning to study the Jews of Ashkenaz, which is actually a family history for many people in this audience and watching this video, where if you went back 500, 600 years, the populations were more or less comparable between the Jews living in Christian Europe, who are sometimes called Ashkenazi Jews, and the Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews living in the Ottoman Empire, North Africa. You know, the stories we told in our last couple classes about the Eastern Jews, the Mizrahi Jews, and the Sephardic Jews, those with roots in Spain. But the Jews living in Europe proper, who are called Ashkenazi Jews, and we'll talk about why that is, were on par with them in terms of population if you went back 600 years ago. But today, even after the Holocaust, which killed not only but predominantly Ashkenazi Jews, there are still many more Ashkenazi Jews in the world than Sephardic Mizrahi Jews. And certainly for Jews in America, while there are certainly many varieties of Jewish diversity, the overwhelming majority of American Jews trace their roots back to Eastern Europe and Central Europe and this population we call Ashkenaz. And so we have to beware a trend that has acquired a very appropriate name. It's called having the approach of being Ashkenormative. You might have heard the term heteronormative, assuming that everybody is a male and a female partnership and that every family has a mom and a dad and so on. Well, Ashkenormative is assuming that everybody ate bagel and kugels and had Yiddish swear words and experienced Jewish culture in an Ashkenazi key. And even if it is the majority experience, it is not the only Jewish experience in America or in Jewish history. But one could be forgiven if one comes from an Ashkenazi background merely by the translation of the word for the language that predominates in this population. The language that predominates among Ashkenazi Jews, at least historically, if not today, is a language called Yiddish. But in Yiddish, the word Yiddish means Jewish. So occasionally you might find someone who's very old today, or certainly the parents of people who are older today, who might have said, does he speak Jewish? Do you speak Jewish? What they meant was, do you speak Yiddish? But the equation of Yiddish equals Jewish writ large is again an example of that Ashkenormative phenomenon that we are heirs to in the American Jewish community. So we are allowed to study Ashkenazi Jews for sure, but we shouldn't assume that they are the template for everybody. Not everybody thinks Fiddler on the Roof is a history lesson. Spoiler alert, it isn't a history lesson even for Ashkenazi Jews, but it isn't the personal history of Sephardic Jews, Mizrahi Jews, Ethiopian Jews, and many other examples. Now, when we look at the history of the Jews in Europe, we understand that it's a story of migration. And there's a gradual trend of moving from west to east. And so I'm going to show you a couple images that highlight this dynamic. Here's one that describes the waves of expulsions, where you have an expulsion from England in 1290. You've got expulsions from France that culminate in 1394. You've got the expulsion from Spain in 1492, from Portugal in 1497, and you see the arrows are predominantly directed to points further east, whether it's points in the Ottoman Empire coming out of Spain, points to the New World coming out of Portugal, or occasionally to the Netherlands, and then points further into Central and Eastern Europe, coming sometimes from Germany and sometimes from these other Western cultures. And one thing to note with the German expulsion, as we'll see later, it was never total. There were always some Jews that stayed in German lands because Germany wasn't a unified state, but the predominant center of Jewish life is going to migrate from west to east. But we start a little bit earlier when Jews are still in the west, specifically in the Rhine Valley, which is more or less the border between France and Germany. This is going back to around the year 1000 of the Common Era. There were Jews living in Europe into the Roman period. In fact, many of them came north with the Roman Empire into Gaul, which is the pre-modern version of France, and into the Rhineland, what becomes ultimately the Holy Roman Empire and Germany. One of the most famous figures of this period in that turn of the millennium is a man named Rashi. Rashi actually is an acronym. It stands for Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, but you just know it by Rabbi Shlomo. You just take the first letters and you get R, S, H, and I. He's known as Rashi. He lived from 1040 to 1105, and he made a living actually as a vintner, raising grapes and making wine. But he became very famous in the world of rabbinic literature for his detailed commentaries on the Hebrew Bible and also on the Talmud itself. So much so that later editions of both the Bible and the Talmud would rarely be printed without Rashi's commentary. He's seen as simply the authoritative answer to not only how the text is meant to be read, but also its implications for rabbinic law and practice. You'll even see sometimes in a Talmud, you'll have the main text with the core text from the Mishnah and the Gemara, the initial rabbinic laws and the later commentaries on it through around the year 600 CE. Those initial texts are in standard Hebrew font. And then you have the commentaries written around it in a different, more sort of hand script, almost cursive kind of font. And that font is actually often called Rashi's script. People sometimes imagine that it's based on Rashi's handwriting. It's not true. It's actually just a different font so you can tell the Rashi from the Talmud. You can keep the commentary separate. It makes it easier to read if it's in a different font. And so you'll sometimes see that as well in what's called a Mikraot Gedolot, a large scriptures, which is a Bible with the commentary around it. And you'll see that Rashi commentary written in the Rashi script. So you actually have to learn two sets of alphabets. They're related, but not exactly the same, to be able to follow that Rashi commentary. So Rashi gains a global Jewish reputation coming out of the town of Troyes, Troyes, that really is not the center of the universe, but it becomes an important Jewish center because of Rashi's contributions. He has a set of followers in his school of thought. They're actually his grandsons, not his sons, because he didn't have any sons. He only had daughters, and supposedly he taught his daughters some things. There's actually a series of historical fiction novels called Rashi's Daughters. It's very fanciful, but it's not real history. But if you like, sort of projected back history, you can take a look at those. But it's the followers of Rashi in the grandson level who are called the Tosafists, which means the adders on, who add on to Rashi's commentary, add an extra explanation to it, and occasionally disagree with him on one issue or another. It's also in this time period that we get a major split between the Sephardic Jews living in Muslim control and the Ashkenazi Jews living in Europe. And that's proclaimed by Rabbi Gershom of Worms, which is in Germany, where he puts in a 1,000-year ban on the practice of polygamy. Living under Christian Europe, the idea of taking more than one wife was anathema to the people around them. And so the Jews decided that they should adjust their practice to not inflame their neighbors, and they decided to take only one wife. Now, Jews living in Islamic rule could follow the Islamic practice of up to 4 wives, which follows the example of Muhammad. So you did have polygamy in Sephardic and Mizrahi Jewish communities living under Islam, where you did not have them under Jews living among Jews living under Christendom, based on Gershom's 1,000-year ban. Now, I will point out that that 1,000-year ban was issued in the year 1000. You may notice that it has expired, but a decision was taken in the late 90s by the rabbi authorities of the day and the Orthodox community that this is what our ancestors and fathers have done. We're going to continue that tradition. So they did not all of a sudden create profiles on JDate looking for wife number 2 or 3. In the meantime, this community of the Jews living in Germany proper take on the name Ashkenaz or Ashkenazi, again, based on a similar kind of projection to the Jews who wrote about themselves as Sephardim. Remember, as I mentioned last time, the Bible refers to different nations living up north and out west, and we don't really know exactly what the Bible is referring to. So this creates the opportunity for the rabbis to say, oh, when they said up north, they meant Ashkenaz, which now is what we're going to call Germany. And when they said out west, they meant Sepharad, which is what we're going to call Spain. So really, it's an application of a term from the Bible that the original authors might have meant something different, but now it's applied to Germany proper. And one of the examples of this is a testimony of the Hasidei Ashkenaz, the pious of this territory of Ashkenaz. Some of them wrote interesting letters, pious poems, but there's also a series of accounts of martyrdom, because those first few centuries of the millennium, 1000 to say 1300, is also a time period of the Crusades. And when the Crusaders were gathering to go reclaim the Holy Land from the infidel, they decided they could practice on the infidels living near them. That is, if there weren't any Muslims around, they could find local Jews. And there were a number of communities where Jews were threatened with martyrdom or conversion, and many of them chose martyrdom. As I mentioned last time, the Sephardim who chose conversion had to deal with some challenges when they tried to come out of the crypto-Jewish, secret Jewish closet and reclaim their Jewish identity, since they didn't follow the example of the martyrs of Ashkenaz who did submit to martyrdom during the Crusades. Now, this is also the period that sees the beginning of the Yiddish language. Now, for those who don't know, Yiddish is mostly Middle German, so not modern German, but an earlier version of German, written in Hebrew letters. And we have examples of other Jewish languages like that. Ladino or Judesmo, for example, is medieval Spanish, written in Hebrew letters. There's a Judeo-Greek as well. These are examples of times where the Jews are actually collaborating with the surrounding environment because their daily language becomes the surrounding language. But they're writing it in the alphabet they already know. And there are certainly some words that are included that come from Hebrew. So the word for rabbi is rabbi. The word for Torah is Torah. The word for Shabbat is Shabbat. Except in Yiddish, it's not Shabbat with a hard T. It's Shabbos, because the hard T at the end becomes a soft S in the Yiddish pronunciation. Or Sukkos would be Sukkot. Or Simchas Torah. You know, it gets a little shift in emphasis, and the last sound can shift sometimes. But by and large, it's the Hebrew words that are included. And sometimes there's even subtleties between the languages. So in Yiddish, you could have a book. But there's two words for book in Yiddish. There's the word Buch, which comes from German. Plural is Bicher, which just means ordinary books. But if you refer to a book as a Sefer, well, a Sefer is a holy book, a prayer book, a Talmud volume, a Bible. That's a Sefer. That's from the Hebrew term, but it means an elevated, a tome, a volume, you know, a different layer of meaning to it. So Yiddish is this combined language of Middle German, some Hebrew words, and some other words sprinkled in from the Jewish historical experience. So the Jews started in the Rhine Valley, and they were influenced by the echoes of the Roman Empire, so much so they even picked a very Latin-based word for a core practice of Jewish religious life. The word for to bless in Yiddish, the word for to bless is bench, from the word benediction, which is a blessing in Latin. So that very core ritual practice of to bench, to bless, well, benchen is the infinitive. It comes from the Latin benediction, as opposed to a Germanic root. But as they moved further east, leaving first the Rhineland, then Germany proper, they began to add other words to this language as well, including words from Slavic origins. So I'll give you one that many of you may already know. What do they call that kerchief that women wear in Eastern Europe? It's called a babushka, right? Comes from baba, which means grandmother. Well, if you know baba is grandmother in Russian or Polish, you might surmise that the Yiddish term for grandmother, bubi, or bube, or bobe, is of Slavic origin. And it was just adopted into Yiddish. It's not the Germanic root, it's the Slavic root. So there are some Slavic words that find their way in as well. So Yiddish is a sort of mishmash, jargon combined language, as some would call it, who didn't respect it. But it stays with the Jews even after they leave. When they move into Poland, when they move into Lithuania, and even into Russia, they don't create Judeo-Polish. They keep speaking Judeo-German or Yiddish. In fact, they even maintain what one linguistic scholar called an internal bilingualism. That is, many people have an external bilingualism. They speak Spanish at home and English on the street, or German at home and Czech in the street if they're living in Czechoslovakia. Many Jews spoke German at home, but they had Czech in public. But in Eastern Europe, the Jews actually had two private Jewish languages. They had Yiddish for daily life, and they had Hebrew as the ritual language, the prayer language, the intellectual language. And there was even a gender split in this, because the word for Yiddish language in Yiddish is mama loshen. Mama means mother. Loshen means tongue or language, actually from the Hebrew lashon. So your mama loshen was what your mom talked to you, what you grew up speaking, literally your mother tongue. But Hebrew was what men learned in the synagogue to pray and to study the rabbinic literature. So there's even a famous example of a translation of the Bible into Yiddish called the Tzena Urena, the Go Out and See, which includes a lot of commentaries and midrashic interpretations and made-up stories added to the biblical narrative. But in the frontispiece to the Tzena Urena volume, it said, for women and for men who are like women. There wasn't any issue of gender fluidity there. What it meant was women could read Yiddish if they knew the alphabet and they spoke it. And men who couldn't read Hebrew and read the original like they should, they could read this version. That's what they meant by for men who are like women, the ones that could only read Yiddish. Still, Yiddish becomes one of the calling cards of Ashkenazi celebration and culture, so much so that as Jews move from Eastern Europe to Latin America, to the United States, to Canada, to Australia, to South Africa, even to Israel, many of them maintain that Yiddish language as a sense of their cultural identity. And they even found Yiddish-speaking schools to train their kids in how to speak Yiddish, to create new Yiddish literature in these new diasporas, because they want to further this cultural identity. We'll learn more about that when we get to the modern period, talking about that migration. Now, life under Christian Europe was not all, bread and roses here. There were certainly a lot of challenges, in particular, the challenges of dealing with persecution under Christendom. And I'll give you just one example of this here. This is imagery you would commonly see in a church alcove or at the entrance to a church. You have two images here of two separate women. One is ecclesia, that represents the church. The other is synagoga, represents the synagogue. Now take a moment to look at what they have in their hands, what their aspect is. What are some things, we'll open for discussion at this point, what are some things that you notice about these two images, the ecclesia on one side and the synagoga on the other? Feel free to unmute yourself if you want to jump in.
Well,
Go ahead.
I was going to say synagoga's staff is broken.
Okay.
And she's blindfolded, it looks like.
Yes. Okay.
And there's I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So the staff is broken.
Yeah.
Sign of the loss of sovereignty, destruction of the temple, expulsion, and she's blindfolded. What is she blind to?
Christianity.
Right. The truth of Jesus. The Jews are blind. They refuse to see. What else do you notice? Ren, do you see something else?
Ecclesia has a crown. She's looking up. She's wearing a cloak, much more powerful, the regalia of royalty and power. I also I've seen ones with synagoga is blindfolded with a snake, kind of insinuating blinded by the devil kind ofness too.
Right.
Maybe she looks like a slave.
Right. In a subordinate position. She's looking down and away. Right. So it's not just that why does she have to look away? She's already blindfolded. But that shows sort of the willfulness of the not wanting to see what should be evidently true to everybody. You notice also she's holding a document. It's being tied to the written law, the written word, as opposed to being freed by the Spirit and by faith. You notice that the staff that Ecclesia is holding is erect and, of course, is in the shape of a cross. And she's also holding a chalice, right? This is, thinking of the cup that Jesus has as part of the communion / Last Supper story and narrative that's reenacted regularly in the church. So again, you would see this outside of the town church or the cathedral in the major city, a graphic demonstration of the attitude of Christians toward the Jews. They're present, but they are not uppity. Remember that discussion of the uppity Jew in the Islamic world, the status of the dhimmi? Well, Jews also had to have a subordinate position in Christian Europe. This goes back to some of the writings of St. Augustine, St. Augustine, who talked about the Jews being preserved as a kind of witness. They were there at the time of Jesus. And so they should be kept around as an example to others of what happens if you reject the truths of the church. So they should be kept miserable. They should be kept separate from Christians to not lead them astray. But they're allowed to stay. Now, this is very different from the treatment of pagans in Europe. The Druids were driven underground or wiped out. And other, native animist kind of religions among the Goths were wiped out. They weren't allowed to be to survive under Christendom. But the Jews were allowed in times and places to have their own communities and to live their own religious life and to survive. Now, for Jews living under Christendom, they generally had a temporary right of residence. They would sign an agreement with the lord of a particular territory or the ruler in charge of a town that they would pay a certain amount of taxes, they would have to live in a certain area, they'd have certain rights, and they'd have certain responsibilities. But it was always a collective right. Remember, this is pre-citizenship. You know, your status comes from your class in society under feudalism, or the guild that you're part of if you're working in a particularly prized profession. But there's no such thing as individual citizenship with individual rights. I mean, that's a much later concept. We can't project that back into the feudal era. But the Jews are able to serve as a kind of economic niche in between the peasantry and the cities. For example, they're not tied to the land like the peasantry is, so they can perhaps serve as the middleman, travel between the town and the city, the kind of primitive merchant or peddler. They're also able, because of the understandings of the prohibition on lending at interest, they're able to lend money to Christians if they have it. Where Christians are not allowed to lend money at interest to Christians, and Jews not allowed to lend money at interest to Jews because of a particular passage in the Torah, which is also, of course, binding on Christians as the Hebrew Bible, they are able to lend money to Christians, which doesn't make them a honored and valued member of society, but it's an important part of society if you want to develop an economy or have functioning marketplaces. And one of the problems with this right of residence being collective and temporary is that it could be revoked. The ruler could decide to cancel all the debts he owed to the Jewish moneylenders, or the religious authorities could decide the Jews are getting too uppity, need to be put back in the synagogue position, and the Jews could be forced to leave. Sometimes they would move to the next town. They didn't have to go that far necessarily, but they were always in this fear of being the wandering Jew. And this is the period when that concept of the wandering Jew really gets its roots. It doesn't make sense in the Sephardic position once they've moved to Amsterdam, once they moved to the Ottoman Empire. They were there for centuries. But the Jews in Europe felt like their role was a little bit more tendentious, and they could, in fact, be required to move. Certainly, the Ashkenazi Jews in Germany proper knew that they had seen expulsions from other Western European countries and that it could happen to them as well. In fact, this is what happened as the result of persecutions accelerating in the 1200s through the 1500s. So here's some examples of the persecutions that took place in this period. You have on the left an example of a blood libel. This is the accusation that Jews would steal or kidnap a Christian child and drain his blood to use in satanic rituals and or the making of matzah as a kind of anti-communion wafer, like the devil's version of a wafer that would be made out of blood. And you'll notice here some interesting details about this picture. Well, again, I can stop it and open up to you. What are some things you notice about this image of the blood libel that's on the left here? This is from a Nuremberg chronicle in 1493. What are some of the features you notice?
I noticed they've got the kid up in the arms out, so it probably is to evoke the Jesus on the cross sort of look.
Absolutely, another innocent suffering and dying, for this.
One of the wounds too is exactly in the same place that you always see Christ's wounds in his chest.
Absolutely.
There's also what looks like possibly a circumcision or something going on down there.
That's right. They're so bloodthirsty and evil that they are attacking the genitals and not just other places. Anything else you notice?
Yeah, everybody's got long noses.
Okay, so the features are somewhat exaggerated. Certainly in the back, on the back right, you see there's someone with an unusual face where the child has a much smaller pert nose. All the men have beards, or almost all the men have beards. What are they wearing? You see the little yellow patch?
Oh.
Oh, yeah.
Many of them have a little yellow. That was not invented by the Nazis. This is a pre-existing European tradition of marking the Jews by clothing as something different. Now, this is not everywhere at all times. But in this part of Germany, when this is being drawn, one of the ways to mark the characters as Jewish is to have them wear this yellow patch that they were required to wear. Also, the hat that one of them is wearing in the left, the sort of conical hat with a ball on top, that was also distinctive of the kind of hat Jews had to wear going out. Now, the other ones aren't wearing it because they're inside, but he maybe was the kidnapper who came in from outside, and so he still has on his hat that was distinctive of Jewish practice. Okay, so here's one example of a visual depiction of this blood libel accusation against the Jews. I mean, obviously, this never happened. And if you know anything about Jewish law, there's actually a horror of including even animal blood in the food. You're supposed to kill the animal by cutting the neck in a way to drain as much blood as possible. You salt all the meat to get rid of as much blood as you can. If you're cooking with eggs, you break the egg into a bowl separately to make sure there's not a blood spot in the egg. Otherwise, you have to throw out the whole dish. So this is, again, sort of a fantasy, but it's also projecting some of the debates that are happening within Christian circles over, is the blood of Christ really what's happening in the communion, or is it just wine? And is it really transubstantiated? Well, the Jews are getting real blood. How guilty are the Jews? It says in the Gospel of Matthew, his blood be upon us, but that was a long time ago. Are they still to blame? Well, they're to blame for what they're doing every week. They're reenacting this. And these accusations of blood libel often would come about during Easter season. Because what's happening during Easter season, you've got the Passion story, you've got the reenactment of the crucifixion. And so in the eternal present of religious stories, the Jews not only persecuted Jesus then, they're doing an equivalent to the innocent Christian child even now. Okay, so these accusations come out in periods like this. Another example of persecution of Jews in Western Europe was the accusation that Jews poisoned the wells during the Black Death. They couldn't explain why so many people were dying, and so maybe it's the Jews who are poisoning the wells. Some people argue that Jews actually were somewhat cleaner than other people because they actually bathed once a week for Shabbat, and they rinsed their hands before every meal, which was way more than anybody else did. Now, they weren't washing with soap, right? But they were doing something, and maybe that had a positive health impact. Again, the way meat was handled back then, I wouldn't give the Jews, 100% scores on hygienic practice, but at least it was better than Christian Europe, who would take one bath a year or two baths a year. I mean, it was, you wouldn't want to have smelled it. And one other accusation I wanted to mention is the accusation of desecrating the host. Now, this doesn't mean being a bad house guest. When they say the host, they're referring to the holy host, the communion wafer. And the accusation was here that Jews would steal the communion wafers, which you can see in the first panel here of the cartoon. They would then torture those wafers. And then in the bottom panels, you see the Christians breaking in the door to find them and then torturing the Jews to confess their sins with fire on the soles of their feet. But you'll notice, if you look carefully, you'll see the two sort of tablets of the Ten Commandments there in that upper right image. And notice on the right, there's a person who's stabbing it with a knife. And what's happening to the wafer? There's blood coming out of it. Now, what's going on here? Remember again, that argument about transubstantiation, does the wine become the blood? Well, what does the wafer become? The wafer in Christian theology becomes the body of Christ. And so this isn't a case where they're saying, well, we believe it's the body of Christ, but the Jews don't believe that. So, maybe, who knows? That's a modern sensibility. The Catholic perspective at the time was everybody knows this is the body of Christ. Even the Jews know this is the body of Christ. And if they want to get back at Christ, they're going to steal his body and torture it just like they did the last time. The reason why they're not Christians is because they're stubborn and evil. It's not because they just have a different, epistemological approach to the universe. So these drawings, again, it never happened. Why would Jews bother stealing the communion wafer to stab it with knives? I mean, this is, from our perspective, this is fantasy. But it was believed at the time because it was part of this argument over whether this is really happening or not, and trying to reaffirm the doctrines of Catholic faith. So ironically, during the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, at times Jews were caught in the middle. Martin Luther was hoping the Jews would join his Protestant version because he went back to the original Bible without the Catholic books the Jews didn't have. But when they rejected him, he rejected them. And you can read terrible things that Martin Luther said about what should be done with the Jews. And for the Catholics, as they're reaffirming the rituals of blood and the body and the communion, which the Protestants have rejected, they're going to blame the Jews or find ways to make the Jews witness again to the truth of Catholic theology, sometimes at the expense of Jewish lives and certainly Jewish stability. So after these expulsions that sent Jews away from Western Europe, and you have basically this end result by 1500 where there aren't Jews in England and France and Spain and Provence and the south of France. They're primarily in the Ottoman Empire or in Italy, in the Netherlands, which had been a Spanish colony, which broke away, and in the Holy Roman Empire and points further east, especially in Poland, Hungary, and Wallachia, which today would be parts of Romania. So the Jews have left the West and moved to the East. They remained in some small numbers in the West as secret Jews, the Sephardim living in Bordeaux in the south of France or in England or in Holland, but explicit Jews, self-identified Jews are gone from Western Europe, and these German Jews bring their language with them as they go points further east, especially into Poland. Now, why Poland? Between the 12th and the 16th century, Poland actually wanted Jews to move into their territory. Sort of like the Ottoman Empire was happy to get the Sephardic Jews, the Polish Empire was happy to get not only Jews, but also Greeks and Germans and other people willing to develop the Polish economy. Poland was primarily feudal landowners and serfs, and they knew they needed some kind of middle class. In fact, during the joint Polish-Lithuanian Empire, which is founded in the 1500s, they explicitly invite Jews in because they want the Jews to develop their towns and cities and to develop their economy. And so the Jews are being pushed out of German lands by persecution, but they're also being welcomed in and attracted in by Polish landowners who see an economic role for them in this territory. The Jews, in fact, do primarily move into cities or small towns. If you think of Fiddler on the Roof again as a documentary, which it's not, he's actually not living in a shtetl. Shtetl is the Yiddish term for a small city. Stadt is a city, like Darmstadt, but shtetl means little city. It's a small town, but it's not a peasant village. Actually, what Tevye lives in is a dorf or a derfel, a little peasant village. But what's the predominant Jewish experience was living in towns, partly for safety, but partly because it's also where the professions were. They generally weren't the milkmen or the farmers. That was, again, in a feudal society, the serfs living on the land, and who wants to be a serf and belong to the land? So the Jews had this middle ground of being craftsmen in cities, or occasionally, again, going back and forth between the cities and the peasantry and the farmland, or between the landowners and the peasantry. So one of their economic roles was as what's called a tax farmer. The term was arendar. What you do if you're a tax farmer is the Lord doesn't want to bother with collecting taxes directly. So he gets someone who says, I'll pay you $1,000 for the right to collect taxes on this town. And the Lord says, great, I get my $1,000 up front. And then it's the tax farmer's job to go to the peasantry and collect the taxes from them. And he makes a living on the difference between what he can squeeze out of the peasantry with the legal right to tax and what he has to pay to the Lord for the lump sum tax payment. So it saves the Lord the hassle, and it makes the enemy the tax farmer who's doing the collecting. It's good to offload your hostility that the peasantry might feel to you on the middlemen who are a convenient scapegoat there.
That's what we call the lawyers now.
Yeah, well, you always have plausible deniability, right? And so they often functioned as managers for these estates. They had the concessions on bridge tolls. Sometimes they even ran taverns. Because again, a tavern is a middleman kind of product, because you take the raw wheat or potatoes that are grown by the peasantry, you process it into liquor and then sell it back to the peasantry. So you wouldn't think of Jewish bar owners or tavern keepers but that was a very common sight in many of these peasant villages and small towns, a niche that Jews held, in addition to being, shoemakers and tailors and those basic small crafts kind of people. But this land of the Polish-Lithuanian Empire became a very comfortable home for Jews for many centuries. So much so that there was an international organization they founded called the Council of the Four Lands, which was sort of like an upper level rabbinical and legal entity that represented the Jews. It lasted from the 1510s to 1764. That's 250 years or so of a relatively stable system of Jewish internal self-governance, especially in regards to religious matters. This is also when the Eastern European model of the yeshiva develops, where you have a local cheder or small school for local boys that taught them how to read and used corporal punishment. It was no paradise. But if they were really talented students, they might get a scholarship to go to a yeshiva, where they would live with someone else's family. They would study as much as they could. They might eventually become a rabbi and get an appointment in a local community, or even go back into the yeshiva system to train the next generation of students. But this is a stable system that lasted for a couple hundred years. So again, you could be forgiven if they were thrown off guard by the Russian Empire coming in and overthrowing the whole system. Now, this idea of Jewish self-governance in Eastern Europe is really based on a Jewish communal organization called the Kahila. Kahila means community literally, but it's also a self-governing organization. Part of it is negotiating those collective rights with the town or the lord to be able to stay in one place. And it was generally run by two groups. There were the rabbinic elite, the learned elite, and there were the merchant class, the ones who had more assets and money. And I call this system of government, I mean, they had votes, but it wasn't really voting. I call it democracy, which means it was ruled by the machers. If you know Yiddish, macher is the mover, the shaker, the people who, think they know what they're doing. And they were the ones who were the parnasim, the officers of the Kahila, of the community. They would even appoint a particular person who was called the shtadlan, the intercessor, who would go and talk to the Lord to negotiate the terms of the agreement. He might be a moneylender. He might be someone who has European manners, who might be able to speak Polish or Russian. And it's that shtadlan, that intercessor, who is able to go to the sort of backdoor communication and negotiate the rights of Jewish residents and the terms of Jewish agreement and toleration and protection for the Jews and so on. There's actually a book of Jewish history from this period, or about this period, called The Lord's Jews, because that's sometimes how they were referred to. They weren't just Polish Jews, they were this particular Lord's Jews, because he was the one in charge of them who gave them the right to stay there. It was the Kahila that hired rabbis. It was the Kahila that taxed itself to pay for its own services, the cheder and the teacher there and other services they provided. And often, because the rich people were in charge, they made a regressive tax. So they would tax Shabbat candles, which of course everyone had to buy. Otherwise, if you didn't buy Shabbat candles, they knew you weren't lighting Shabbat candles and you'd be kicked out of the community. You could get expelled, in fact, with a cherem. But they also would support, mutual support, charities, what were called chevras. Today, you might have heard of something called the Chevra Kadisha, which is the holy society. It's the one that helps care for bodies after someone has died, to wash the body and make sure someone's sitting with it at all times. But there were all sorts of chevras that provided dowries to orphaned girls so they could get married, that provided basic alms to the poor, soup kitchens, that kind of support. It was its own sort of state within a state, because the bureaucracy of the Polish state was very weak on the ground level. Jews sort of stepped in that way to provide the kind of mutual support and services that were needed. But this life was still precarious. Near the end of this period, in the 1640s, in 1648 and 49, there was a massive Ukrainian peasant uprising, because you had Polish landowners who were the absentee landowners setting the terms. You had the Ukrainian peasantry, Cossacks and others, living on the land and forced to work the land. And then you had Jewish landowners who were the managers of the estates for the Polish landlords. Well, when there's a peasant uprising, guess who they're going to target? They can't get to Poland to reach the Polish landowners, but they can target the Jews, who are the agents of the Polish landowners and the ones who've been oppressing them directly with taxes, with exploiting them with liquor and all kinds of other accusations, not to mention the usual religious ones that we've already talked about. So between 1648 and 1649, this massive revolt under a man named Bogdan Khmelnytsky killed some tens of thousands of Jews. We don't know exactly how many. Again, the records are limited, but it was certainly a massive destruction of Jewish life. And an interesting side note, when the Russian army took over the Crimean Peninsula, including taking over a number of Ukrainian naval vessels, One of the naval vessels they took over was the SS Khmelnytsky, which I read and I thought, wow, because I've always heard that name as like Hitler. I mean, this is someone who killed tens of thousands of Jews. But for the Ukrainians, he's a national folk hero who fought back against foreign domination. So again, terrorist, freedom fighter, depends on who's making the call there.
As someone from the South, I can point out that.
That's right. The War of Northern Aggression. It's a very different story. So here we have this world where Jews have lived for centuries. They've set down roots. They have self-governing communities, but their life is still precarious. There can still be riots and interventions that destroy established Jewish communities, that force Jews to move. They've kept their language as Yiddish, but they're still living in some cases, as they say, like a fiddler on the roof. I will point out, by the way, that reference is actually not from any of the stories of Sholem Aleichem. It's from the artwork of Marc Chagall, who painted fiddlers floating in the air and fiddlers on the roof, and that's where the title for the musical came from, not from the original stories of Tevye the Milkman. But this precarious life actually sets the stage for the growth of a kind of radical messianism and even a turn to mysticism, where you want sort of radical connection to God and radical solutions to things, that the pious version of praying for the Messiah to eventually come just isn't cutting it anymore in the aftermath of the Khmelnytsky destruction. And so that's the turn we'll get to next time as we talk about the rise of Hasidism, rebirth of Jewish mysticism, and the aftermath of the dislocation of the Khmelnytsky pogroms.